Welcome, everyone, to this presentation of John Alden's Choice, a historical reenactment of love, war, and Anglo-American friendship, sponsored by the Alden House Historic Site. My name is Desiree Mobed, and I'm the Executive Director. Together with the Alden Kindred of America, we preserve and share the legacy of Mayflower passengers John and Priscilla Alden and their homestead in Duxbury, Massachusetts. Today, we're going to take a journey back to 1920 and the 300th anniversary of the Mayflower to explore England's grand historical pageant, John Alden's Choice. Performed on the quays of Southampton with several hundred actors, this program told the story of not just John Alden and his romance with Priscilla, but the history of America and its bond with Great Britain. Just a few years after the end of World War I, a relationship that we'd especially like to recognize as we share our condolences today on the passing of Prince Philip. We're honored to be joined by Dr. Tom Hulme, a senior lecturer in modern British history at Queen's University in Belfast. He's written widely about how Britons in the 19th and 20th centuries connected with their local and national past, from large-scale historical reenactments like John Alden's Choice and city commemorations to the building of monuments and memorials. Tom is the director of Voyaging Through History, the Mayflower and Britain, 1620 to 2020, a collaborative project with the University of Exeter and the British Library. As part of his research, we do encourage you to put where you're joining from in the chat, and please do participate in the question and answer session at the end of this program. If you have to leave early, or you would like to share this program with others, a recording will be posted on the Alden website. And now, from across the pond, let's welcome Tom Hulme.
Well, thank you very much, Desiree. And then it's a delight to be back here speaking again with the members and friends of the Alden Trust, Alden House. And as you said, I'm going to be talking about the port of Southampton today, which is down in Hampshire on the south coast of England, and this great pageant that they put on in 1920. Now, I think if you asked most people to name the port from which the Mayflower had left England, they'd actually probably say Plymouth, which is down in another English county, Devon. And in one sense, they would be right. The Pilgrims did depart from Plymouth on the 16th of September, 1620, and they didn't stop again until they reached the American coast. And of course, we all know that the name of the new colony was Plymouth as well. But quite a lot of people think that the Pilgrims chose that name for the colony in memory of the port that they left. And it's certainly true that a lot of people back in Plymouth in England like to claim that as fact as well. But it's actually the case that the site where they had settled had originally been called Plymouth some years earlier by that famous explorer, John Smith, and he gave lots of other English and Scottish place names to locations in New England as well. So if you look on this map, you can see Plymouth down there in the bottom left corner, but you might also be able to see Dartmouth and Cambridge and Edinburgh, amongst other places as well. So it was already called Plymouth. Maybe the Pilgrims did decide to keep the name for sentimental reasons, but as far as I'm aware, there isn't actually any firm evidence for that. But at any rate, the new settlement was called Plymouth. That was indeed the last port of departure. And I think that's why it's quite common for people to not know that there were other English ports that also played a role in this story. And one of the most important, or possibly the most important of those ports, is Southampton. And it was from this busy town in Hampshire that the Pilgrims had first left on the 15th of August, 1620. And that had actually been their plan all along. Another ship, the Speedwell, had brought members of the congregation from Leyden in the Netherlands to Southampton, and then the Mayflower had come up from London to Southampton to join them before they were set to make their voyage together. And this fact is especially important for John Alden descendants because it was in Southampton that John Alden was hired as a cooper, which was essentially the man who looked after the beer barrels during the voyage, which I think is probably the job I would like to have had on the Mayflower. But John, of course, signed the famous Mayflower Compact on board the ship. He decided to stay in the New World when the Mayflower returned to England in 1621. And we think pretty soon after this, in 1622 or 1623, he married Priscilla Mullins. And the rest, as they say, is history. Now, John's story isn't that well known in Britain today, I don't think, but that's not always been the case. And so to understand how they came to be in 1920, this historical play or pageant that bore his name, we do have to go back a little bit first into the century before. And we can start, I think, with Henry Longfellow's famous poem, The Courtship of Miles Standish, which was published in 1858 and sold in London. An astonishing 10,000 copies of this were sold on that first day. So clearly, at that point at least, this was a well-known and much-loved work. And Longfellow, he said that he had got the basis of his story directly from Alden family folk histories. So I don't need to go into too much of this, but in a nutshell, this poem told the romantic tale of Captain Miles Standish and his amorous intentions towards the young Patricia Mullins before she eventually married John Alden in the new Plymouth colony. Now, in this poem, there is only a very small mention of Southampton, when John describes Priscilla as being the beautiful Bertha, the spinner, the Queen of Helvetia, she whose story I read at a stall in the streets of Southampton. That's the only mention. But before Longfellow's poem was published, there was actually very little mention of the fact that Mayflower had left Southampton. But now, and I think probably because of the popularity of this poem, people started to sit up and take notice of the historic role that Southampton had actually played. And one of the most interesting points at which we can see this changing, and I think definitely for Alden descendants, happened in 1872. And this was the year that the Admiral James Alden visited Southampton, and he was passing through the town on his way to London on official diplomatic duties relating to the Alabama claims of the recent Civil War. Now, James Alden was a decorated war veteran. He participated in the captures of Veracruz and Tabasco in the Mexican-American War, and he'd also fought on the Union side in the Civil War too. Now, Southampton's town council was pretty excited about this visit, and they thought that this was a great opportunity to lay out a grand civic welcome. So they decorated the towns with American flags. They took an official tour with the Admiral around the ruins of Netley Abbey to show him a sort of ancient English site. And later, at the usual civic dinner, Admiral Alden was received with loud applause, especially when he jovially made reference to how his own family had come from Southampton in the Mayflower 250 years before. So interest in Southampton in the Mayflower by this point is beginning to grow. And this is also a point at which people in Southampton start to write local histories in the 1870s and 1880s. And in these local histories, the story of Southampton was not complete if at least a few paragraphs hadn't been given to the Mayflower story. And this was usually through a kind of self-aggrandizing nod towards how the English pilgrims, and they were always described as English pilgrims, were the founders of American liberty. So already we can see how that connection between Britain and the USA was being made. But it's really by the end of the 19th century that those diplomatic relationships between those two countries are blossoming. And there is a widespread outpouring of statements about Anglo-American friendship and how this friendship was built on a shared heritage. So the Mayflower, of course, was a ship that had left one country and moved to the next, carrying the pilgrims on board. That was a symbol that could quite literally be used to link the two across the Atlantic Ocean. Now, Southampton was eager to get in on this transatlantic coming together. And in 1913, it unveiled its own Pilgrim Fathers Memorial, which I spoke about a bit in my last talk for the Alden House, which you can now see on YouTube. But Southampton was a really important port at this time as well. Just a year later, when the First World War broke out, it was Britain's port number one. Millions of men passed through its harbour to the Western Front in France. And American soldiers too were heavily based in the town after the USA had entered the war in 1917. And these American soldiers were largely made to feel pretty welcome in Southampton. When it was Independence Day in 1918, for example, the streets were decorated in red, white and blue bunting for these American soldiers. And apparently this was a gesture that was much appreciated by those soldiers. So of course, two years after the end of the First World War, 1920, the 300th anniversary of the Mayflower voyage was coming around. So of course, this is a great opportunity for the mayor and town council of Southampton to get in on the act again, to play on that popular Anglo-American enthusiasm for the global role of those two countries in the reconstruction of the 1920s. So again, much like when Admiral Alden had visited in 1872, there were civic dinners, there were speeches, but there was entertainment programs as well. There were swimming competitions, there were public dances. But by far the biggest event of this commemoration in 1920 was what was called a historical pageant. So you may have heard of a historical pageant before, you may have not, but I think they probably will look quite familiar to you in some respects. Anyone that watched the opening ceremony of the Olympic Games in London in 2012 might possibly recognise this sort of scene. So these historical pageants had actually become popular in the early part of the 20th century. They were invented by a man called Louis Napoleon Parker, and he was an Anglo-American of sorts. He had a mixed English-American and some French background as well, as you can probably tell from the name Louis Napoleon. But the essence of his invention was a theatrical reenactment of episodes that were picked or plucked from the local or national past. And they were usually performed outside, as you can see here, and preferably in a place that had some historic importance. And if you could fit that into the narrative of the pageant as well, much the better. But importantly, the roles in these pageants, the acting roles, were taken by amateur performers, and they were also absolutely massive casts. In some of the biggest pageants, like the Pageant of London, we're talking about as many as several thousand people taking part in performing roles. Not all at once, but all at least during the course of the pageant, which might be anything from an hour and a half to 3 hours long. Now, the subject matter of the pageant varied depending on where it was being performed, what purpose it was being performed for as well. But you had at one end of the scale tales about kings and queens in England, and the other, what might seem like quite boring local stories about the development of markets or town councils and so on. But the point of the pageant was simple. These were romantic reenactments, and they were about telling a story of progress, both local and national, and how those two things work together. And above all, about how the great power in the present, whether it be of the town or of the nation, had its foundations in the distant past. Now, these pageants became so popular in the early 20th century that people started to talk about there being a pageant season, which took place in the summer. I mean, try performing one of these outside in the winter in Britain and you would quite quickly be disappointed. And another new word entered the British lexicon at this time, pageantitis, which was an illness that was caused by an excessive immersion in reenacting the past. So Southampton's pageant, John Aldens' choice, was just the latest in a long line of pageants, but it was different because it had an international narrative as well, as we will see. So it took place on the west quay of the harbour in July 1920 in the summer, and it had a huge cast. We're talking 450 people here coming together to perform this pageant 4 times across a week or so, and we're talking about crowds numbering around 8,000 people all together. And you can see them packed into a specially made grandstand there. And if you just look in the top right corner, that's the Southampton Memorial. So they had this close to that important historic location. So the director of the pageant was a man called Neville Lovett, and he was a rector at the St Mary's Church in Southampton, but also an amateur enthusiastic producer of historical plays, and he'd been putting on these in Hampshire for some years by this point. But this was a bit of a family affair as well. He brought his daughter, who was called Myra, on board to write the script. She'd been acting in pageants, not just her father's, but others as well, for a number of years as well. And all of the key roles in this pageant were taken by local people. None of them were particularly famous, but I have managed to find a few details about those that played the key roles, i.e. the pilgrims, because I thought that these might be interesting for the descendants who are tuning in today. So first up, we have here, and you can see their signatures as well, the protagonist, John Alden. So John Alden was played by a man called Reginald James Falconer, who was born in Bristol in 1891, which made him about 29 years of age at the time of the pageant. So Reginald lived in Southampton, where he worked as a life insurance salesman. So not a very glamorous career, but he was known locally as being a very, very talented amateur actor. Next up here, we have Priscilla Mullins, and her part was taken by a local woman called Marjorie Foy. She'd been born in 1891 in South Stoneham, which was a sort of rural district close to Southampton. It's now been swallowed up in the larger city. She would have been about 25 at the time of the pageant. And like Reginald, she was quite well known for her acting, but also working as a singer. All of the other well-known pilgrims that made up the original voyage were played by local men who were associated with Congregationalism. So I went into this a little bit in my last talk, but basically Congregationalism was a non-conformist denomination that liked to trace its beliefs back to the pilgrims in the 17th century. So I've put some of their autographs here, which came in the same book that Priscilla and John's autograph were in. And I'll give you some details about these people. So William Brewster, he was played by the Reverend T.H. Harries, who was born in Wales and was about 45 years old at the time of the pageant. And he was a preacher in the nearby village of Bursledon. Edward Winslow, he was played by another Reverend, William Vincent Cook. He was born in Surrey, but he was again a pastor in a local village in Bitterne, just near Southampton, and he was about 65 at the time of the pageant. Isaac Allerton, he was played by a man called R.J. Foote, and he wasn't a reverend, but he was a much associated Congregationalist. He was very, very active in his local Congregationalist community in the village of Hythe, and he was about 60 years old at the time of the pageant and actually died just a year later. Finally, William Bradford. He was played by, I think, the quite wonderfully named Reverend Harold Hardy Holder, which is a bit of a mouthful. And he was another minister in that village of Bitterne and aged about 35 at the time of the pageant. Now, I think from those names and ages, one thing might strike you straight away about all of these performers is that they were, by some distance, in some cases, older than the characters they were playing. And I don't think this was an accident, but I think it reflected really the tendency at the time to portray the pilgrims as being these wise, older bearded men, maybe because it gave them a sense of gravitas, perhaps. Unfortunately, there was one character I'm sure people would have liked to have known a little bit more about, and that is Miles Standish, who plays a role in the pageant. But all I could find out about him was that he was played by a local man called A. Weir. Looks like he's in about his 40s here, but I couldn't find any more details about him. But anyway, those are some of the characters. What was the pageant actually about? Well, the choice that is referred to in the title was a simple one. Should John Alden stay in Southampton, which was his home, or should he leave on the Mayflower for the New World? And I think this framing device of it being a choice probably came from William Bradford's original 17th century history of Plymouth Colony, which we know that Myra, the author, had read. And in that manuscript, Bradford notes how John Alden was hired for a cooper at Southampton, where the ship was being victualled, and he was being a hopeful young man with much desire, but left to his own liking to go or stay when he came here. But he stayed and married here. So I think that is where that element of this being a choice came from, Bradford's own words. Now, if this sounds like a historical pageant or play that was based in serious fact because of that Bradford element, well, in reality, it was anything but, as we're now going to see. Myra Lovett, this author, she absolutely let her imagination run wild with this story and how she wanted to fit it into the present and why she thought it was an important story to tell. So what I'm going to do is go through each scene and give you a bit of a sense of what the action was about. Okay, so the pageant began with a brief prologue, which was essentially read out to the crowd by one of the performers. And this prologue urged the spectators to watch the Mayflower and its story on its way out to sea because it carried Alden of our town, a man who saw within a vision clear what should be. And this was supposedly a kinder, wider age, which was safeguarded by the two nations of the world, Britain and the USA. So that was the beginning. The first proper act of the play was then a kind of real hodgepodge of different happenings, all taking place on the town quay of Southampton in the summer of 1620. So the exact same spot, but 300 years before. So it had things like longshoremen loading the boats with the cargo that was to be sailed out to the Mayflower, the largest ship that was anchored in Southampton's harbour. There were also jokes as well about the solemn piety of the pilgrim travellers. At one point, there was an old hard of hearing sailor, John Elmo, who was quizzed about his own memories of exploring with Francis Drake. And there are songs about the power of the English Navy. So this is a kind of jingoistic, patriotic opportunity for people to remember the power of the British Army and Navy in their shadow of the First World War. But there's comic relief as well. At one point, a Frenchman is discovered hiding in a barrel. And this is actually also the cue for John Alden to enter, because it is he that opens the barrel to reveal this Frenchman leaping out. So the crazed crowd that is watching this is afraid that this Frenchman is a devil, but it turns out that he is just a Huguenot, a weaver who is on the run from the Catholic Church. So those of you that know your history will know that that is anachronistic. That's a different period, but Myra wanted to fit this in anyway because she thought it was a good, amusing incident. But anyway, after that mini episode, John Alden then performs a song about the people of Southampton. I won't sing it for you, but the first verse went something like, where the kind old sea rides into the land, being wishful like to give her a hand, and the tall fine ships lie side by side, bowing and bending like to the tide, the folks of Hampton go their ways, now as in the spring of days. So there was a lot of this. There was music and there was dance, as well as the kind of more serious dialogue too. Back in the pageant, John was told off by a stern Puritan minister for doing this sort of loud, obnoxious singing. And then, bizarrely, he ends up in the local town stocks. And this is to do with some long drawn out affair about road digging. I'm not kidding, that was apparently an important entertainment factor. And it's at that point as well that John's girlfriend at the time, a woman called Prunell, enters the fray. So she sees her boyfriend John in the stocks, and at first she's upset. But that actually quite quickly turns to embarrassment, and she describes John Alden as being a foul-mouthed ruffian and storms off the stage. But have no fear, at this point, the Pilgrim Fathers themselves enter the scene for the first time. And we have John Carver, William Brewster, Edward Winslow, Isaac Allerton, Miles Standish, and of course, William Bradford. And the Pilgrims, they express their disgust at how John is being treated by the people of Southampton. And they see this as being a pretty good example of the general waywardness of England that they want to escape. So they try to persuade John, come with us on the Mayflower for a new life. And it's at this point as well that Priscilla Mullins comes onto the scene. And she sings a song about the piety of the Pilgrim enterprise. And she expresses her sympathy with this man, John Alden, and how he's been treated. She then also tries to persuade John to leave Southampton as well, telling him that if he does, the Pilgrims will plant a race sturdy and strong and full of love to men and faith to God. Unfortunately, though, John Alden is not so sure about making this trip, although he does say that he's half persuaded that for such a wench as Priscilla, it would be worth going to the cold pole itself. So not a very charming way to speak about his future wife, although he didn't know it at the time. But now, if you're still with me, this is when the pageant starts to get really quite strange. A fortune-telling gypsy enters the stage, and John says to her, I be in a great perplexity, where I think some knowledge of the future would aid me. I be half-minded to go to the Americas. Will you not tell me whether such going shall be to my advantage? But the gypsy, she can do better than tell John. She can show him. And thus begins Act 2 of the pageant, which is a series of fantastical visions of the future of the New England colonies. So these come quick and fast, and I think are quite interesting, if a little bit strange. So in the first scene, the gypsy imagines for John Native Americans dancing and singing near the Pilgrim Fathers as the fledgling colony mourns the death in 1621 of John Carver, who, as we know, of course, was the first governor of the colony. And you can see there on the left, Massasoit, who was the native chief, proclaiming peace between the two peoples. But the Pilgrims at this point, they still worry about the wilderness and the prospect of their perishing. So the gypsy, back in 1620, now turns to John, who is surveying the scene, and she asks him, "Through these tears and pain, they build a nation. Go you or remain?" But unfortunately, again, John is not yet moved. So he replies to the gypsy that he will remain in Southampton. So she takes him to the next vision, skipping forward 150 years to 1773. And she's now in Boston, Massachusetts, where the locals are debating the uncertain future of the Americans. The crowd chants, "No representation, no taxation," as they throw chests of tea into the harbour. One man who is watching this sadly says, "I fear this is an end of a British colony," to which another man replies, "No, sir, it is the birth of a great nation." In the next scene, which is now set in 1789 and the action has moved to New York, George Washington takes his oath as president and thanks the citizens for their loyalty during the American Revolution. Back in 1620, the gypsy again turns to John Alden and she says, "Thus the great daughter spurns the motherland, breaks from her hold her too confining hand. She is set forth a great race to maintain as a free nation." And she asks John, "Go you or remain?" So John here is faced with the prospect that if he leaves on the Mayflower, it would lead to the breaking away of the American colonies from his home country of Britain. So he replies, "I remain." But on the gypsy goes, and now she shows the Civil War. Now in this scene, there is a local actor you can see knelt down there, and Mr. H.W. Hyde, playing a character called Jackman, who's an African-American slave, and Hyde plays him in blackface, which was quite common at this time on both sides of the Atlantic. Now, both the language that is used in this scene, which included the N-word, and the depiction of Jackman as being simple-minded, deferential, and so on, would strike us today as being, explicitly racist. But there was a little bit more nuance portrayed in this scene as well. At one point, for example, Jackman does admit to the two women that you can see here that his own people are ignorant, stupid, and frightened, but very grateful to the white people who are laying down their lives in the war. So a sort of hackneyed telling of the Civil War narrative there. One of these women responds by saying that she's sure he's a good sort of creature, but not worth all this terrible slaughter. But at this point, the other woman interjects and says it is they that are to blame for this incident. It's them that are to blame for Jackman being taken away from his home in Africa. Now, she says, they have to give up their children in the Civil War to right this great wrong. So we can see the influence of, abolitionist narratives of slavery here as well, and from a Christian perspective too. But at this point, after this kind of quite long scene between this African-American man and those two women, none other than Abe Lincoln himself enters, and I think this is him there in the massive stereotypical beard and top hat, and he prepares to deliver his great speech at Gettysburg in 1863. Yet amazingly, the abolition of slavery, the end of the Civil War, but still, John Alden says he wants to stay in Southampton. So finally, in the fifth scene of this second act, a woman who plays the Spirit of Britannia enters, and she describes the horrors of taking her children to war in 1914, almost 300 years after John Alden's own lifetime. And she laments how so many of her children are now lying dead in foreign fields. At this point, the Spirit of America, you can see here with the eagle on top of her head, she also joins the scene. And she declares, "Far across the sea, I heard faint voices calling, and they waked old longings, old forgotten memories, old ties of blood, and friendships of the past. And I remembered I was born of England, born of the men who sailed from this fair port. All the long past and love and the close tie which bound us once together turned me and came again whence sailed the Mayflower." And at that point, Auld Lang Syne is sung, and soldiers, both British and American, cross the stage. Now finally, back in the present of 1620, a shocked John Alden declared that he must now go, because he had heard one say that help should come to England in great need from the forthgoing of the Mayflower. So it's these visions of the USA entering the First World War on the side of Britain that seals John's choice. And for the pageant's authors, as they describe in the kind of program that goes along with the pageant, any Englishman would have made the same decision as John Alden, not only from pride in the great future of the country to which they were sailing, but also from affection for that country that they were leaving. So that was John Alden's choice. Now, the final act of the pageant returns to the town quay, and after the quite heavy telling of the previous scene, it returns to jovial humour as well. The town beadle, who you can see here on the left, he comes across a man who is attempting to throw an old woman into the harbour to see if she will float, declaring, of course, that she is a witch. An excited crowd gathers and watches this as well, and the beadle eventually tries to stop the man, but it's only when John Alden, this heroic figure, steps forward and offers assistance that the man is stopped from throwing the woman in the sea. And at this point, the mayor approaches and sends the crowd off before asking John, is there anything he can do for him? John asks quite simply, he wants to be free of his apprenticeship in Southampton so he can go with the Pilgrims to New England. The mayor says, of course you may. So John joins the Pilgrims and bids farewell to the crowd as the boat carrying to the Mayflower sails away. Phew. So that was the John Alden Choice pageant. And I've condensed about 2.5 hours of action into about 15 minutes there. So I've had to miss a few things out, but that is essentially what happened in the storyline. But what can we take from this play? Well, clearly, I think in 1920, it had a primary goal, and that was to cement the idea of friendship between the USA and Britain in the context of the First World War victory and the immediate years of Reconstruction. And there were other events that happened alongside the pageant, which I think can show us why this was happening in the way it did. So there was a civic luncheon as well, which had around 400 guests. The great and the good from both Britain and the USA turned up for this dinner, and they were dining on British delicacies like cold ham, stewed fruit and custard. Sounds delicious. But Lord Birkenhead, who had been the British Attorney General during the war and was now the Lord Chancellor, he gave a speech at this dinner where he said, I profoundly believe that in the state of affairs produced by the war and in view of the threat to civilization, only the close association and sympathy of the British and American people can avert the perils that menace the world. So what were these perils that Birkenhead was talking about? Well, he said, during the war, strange doctrines and heresies abounded, with people being told that democracy had met its final refutation and that they must look to the Soviets. On the contrary, said Birkenhead, the civilization of the world had no surer anchor than the historical traditions of the British people. So there are references here being made to the Russian Revolution and the potential that that revolution might spread beyond Russia to countries like Britain and the USA. At this point, an American general, Charles H. Sherrill, he responds to this speech of Birkenhead, and he also insists we must build up an enduring Anglo-Saxon alliance which will stand against all of these attacks. So according to the Observer newspaper, the world had changed. Isolation was now impossible. World affairs could no longer be allowed to conduct themselves haphazardly. So in a strange sort of way here, this is high-level politics during this commemoration. This is about building a sense of a common culture, of Anglo-Saxon blood, and of military cooperation between these two world powers. America obviously being the rising world power, Britain in a steady state of decline. So John Alden's Choice, this historical pageant, that played an important role. That was the theatrical and fun imagining of this belief in Anglo-American supremacy. But what was the response of the public to the pageant? Well, mostly it was positive. The local newspapers, of course, were much impressed by these happenings. The Southampton Times praised what they saw as being the balance of moments of pathos, like the death of John Carver, with times of quite uproarious fun, such as when a Frenchman living in the town appears on the quay with a bitter complaint about the water supply. The Times also said that it was good pageantry for its idealism and inspiration, and that all the performers had put their hearts into it, which ensured a result that was worthy of the occasion, the 300th anniversary of the sailing of the Mayflower. And the Hampshire Advertiser added on something which I think is quite interesting, especially for us today. They said that the audience must have come away with a feeling of clear kinship to America and of insight into the history of their town. Now, there were other newspapers that commented on this as well. The Observer that I mentioned before, which was a national rather than a local newspaper, that was a little bit sniffier about the pageant. It noted that it suffered from the usual frailties of a first performance, but it did admit in the end it was a great success. And it wasn't just getting column inches in Britain. Many American newspapers were reporting on the pageant too. Both the New York Times and the Chicago Tribune carried a report, as did smaller newspapers in New England as well. They described the action for their readers and also the speeches that had been given by Lord Birkenhead and General Sherrill. And it's also the case that it wasn't just English people watching this performance. Many Americans came to watch it as well. Some of them had arrived literally on the morning of the performance on the Imperator steamship, which you can see here. And these visitors, much like on Independence Day during the First World War, were welcomed enthusiastically. The town and the port and the ship as well were bedecked with American flags. We do know that the pageant was filmed at the time, but unfortunately, as far as I'm aware, it hasn't survived to the present. Although I do live in hope that someone has got it in their attic somewhere and it might turn up, which does occasionally happen with films from this period. But we do know that cinemas across Britain showed a short reel of the performance, and that even copies were sent to the USA and showed in the cinemas there as well. So, to conclude, John Aldens' choice, what can we say about it? Well, it was a way that people at the time joined together the past and the present. And it was a way for them to reflect on the importance of the Anglo-American relationship at a time when many countries, most obviously Russia, were experiencing revolutions. But at the same time, for people in Southampton, this was a more local opportunity. It was a chance for them to join their own history to a bigger international story, something they hoped would put their little town on the world map. Now, if that first ship, the Speedwell, hadn't have been so leaky, the two ships would not have had to turn back to Plymouth at all. So what was essentially an accident of history meant that Southampton's place in the memory of the Mayflower had often been forgotten, something which really annoyed people that lived in Southampton back in 1920, and I know continued to annoy them throughout the 20th century as well. So in 1920, the pageant was an opportunity to put that right, to remind the watching world that it was from this Hampshire port that the Mayflower had originally left. And John Alden, by virtue of being a Southampton local, thus linked together the English town to the development of the emerging world power of the USA. But also on a much more basic level, this was, for the people that took part and for the people that watched, a lot of fun. It was a way to meet friends. It was a way to revel in dressing up in the past, and above all, to forget the troubles of the present. And I think that's something which we could all probably do with at the moment. Thank you.
Tom, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating and a lot of fun. What great images you were able to collect there. I know we have people joining us just to share this all the way from California, got up maybe even early to watch this, even Montana and into the South and of course New England. So it's a lot of Alden descendants, so welcome to everyone out there. And now an opportunity to ask Tom some of the questions that I know you've been writing down in the chat and so forth. So this was my question, Tom, from Jane, and that is, was this pageant repeated? Was it performed again? It's certainly a lot of fun, and hope that it had more than one or, you know, a showing for a year.
That's a great question. So no, unfortunately, as far as I'm aware, it was never performed again. So the script survives. There's a beautiful photo album. There was all the press coverage, but it never happened again. I think that's maybe because its storyline was so specific to that First World War moment that even just a few years after that, it might not have made as much sense anymore. So there were lots of other pageants in 1920 on both sides of the Atlantic that reenacted a more kind of classic story of the Pilgrims. You know, they focused more on their time in England growing up, more on their time in Leyden and the eventual voyage as well. And it was really only this specific pageant that went so crazy into the kind of the visions of the future. But in a strange sort of way, what made it so exciting was what made it probably not quite as relevant for the future. Certainly, I couldn't see us reenacting it today. It would be a very strange narrative.
I'm awed with the number of people that were involved. One of the reports said it was over 400, and just trying to figure out how to stage that, you know, in a downtown area of as big a city as Southampton to make sure everyone got to watch it. It's an impressive feat for sure. And the sound too, that it would carry.
Yes, I mean, amazing in terms of organisation, how these events took part. And it wasn't just the performers that were voluntary, it was everything about it. So that grandstand would have been put up by local people. All the costumes would have been made and sewn by local parties of working women. Often a lot of the stage and the set would have been made by children in workshops at school. So this is a real kind of community act. It's everyone coming together to play this pageant. And usually the only people that got paid for these pageants was the director. It was very uncommon for any of the performers to get paid in this period. Later in the 20th century, when there were other bigger pageants, they might pay some of the kind of the stars, the leading performers. But at this point, as far as I'm aware, everyone did this for free. They did it because they wanted to, because they enjoyed it, and I suppose because they believed in the story being told as well.
So, what amazes so many people is that this was really performed almost right after the end of World War I. Certainly, a devastating time for England and, so much of the world. And yet, the ability to pull together and pull the town together and perform this and create it is really sort of astounding.
It is. I mean, in history, there used to be, there has been a long-running argument about what happened in the 1920s. What was the response to the First World War? And did people become more modern, and did they reject those older ideas of patriotism and symbolism of British power? More recently, historians have said, well, actually, there was an attempt in many cases to return to those older ideas of stability. And things like the historical pageant, even though it was only 20 years old by that point, that was a kind of anchor for people. It was a recognizable cultural form. It was a way that they'd come together in the past. So actually in 1918, this seemed like a really good idea that, well, this has worked in the past to bring people together, so it might work again. And there was a national committee that was put together in 1918 to talk about how do we, commemorate the end of this great conflict in which so many people have lost their lives. And one of the things they suggested was historical pageants, that they thought this would be a good way to deal with that issue, that it would be cathartic for the people taking part. And I think a lot of the scenes that you get in pageants, people could sort of map on their current understandings and fears and hopes onto those scenes. So funerals, for example, when they happen in pageants, could be quite, emotional moments for people in the present. We know that in some pageants, when there was a funeral scene, the people in the audience would take their caps off as a mark of respect. So, while these were very fun events, people took the story seriously as well.
There's an interesting comparison to this play. And then again, what happened after World War II, when the Warwick Charlton, really pushed to build the replica of the Mayflower. And again, thinking, that connection to yet again a Mayflower story and piece of history and the shared connections between America and England. So another question for you is our Aldens are on top of all of these things, Tom, and that is, this is from Richard Banks, was John Aldens' English girlfriend a real person? And if so, what became of her? Inquiring minds want to know.
Almost certainly not a real person. So the actual material that we have for John Aldens' life in Southampton is tiny. The only detail we have is the one that William Bradford gives us, which is that he was employed as a cooper. We don't really even know if it's Southampton that John Alden was actually from. There have been debates throughout the 20th century about whether he was from Harwich, which is where the ship was built, or whether he was actually born in Southampton. So we don't have any firm evidence, and there are competing theories. But I'm almost certain that Prunelle, as she was called, was an invention. She was a foil, really. I mean, possibly building on that kind of romantic tradition of the Longfellow poem, which was, so focused on that romance between Priscilla and John, that they wanted a foil for that. And that was what poor Prunelle played in this pageant. A lot of P's there.
A lot of P's, yes. And you touched on Priscilla briefly. How is she represented in this play?
Very, very pious, innocent, kind, sympathetic. So when she comes on and she sings her song, John Alden's song is about Southampton and about, you know, sailing and adventure. And Priscilla's song that she sings is about the mission of the Pilgrims and their piety as well. So she plays a sort of, yes, an innocent but enthusiastic maiden, really. And she shows her sympathy to John Alden, and it's almost suggested that it is her that persuades him, you know, to come on this adventure, although it takes the gypsy to seal the deal. But you know, she's a very sympathetic character in the pageant.
So with so many Aldens who have joined this program, and some of them have noted, you know, their lineage, we have another question about Priscilla. You know, for someone who has, I think it's 2 mentions in history, it's frustrating to learn more about her. So here's another one, Tom. Was she a great beauty? And please be careful with your answer.
Wow, I mean, I have to be careful here.
Yes.
There are no surviving images, as far as I'm aware. I think I'm right in saying that the only surviving portrait of one of the original Pilgrims is of Edward Winslow. So, I mean, she must have been a great beauty for John Alden to have married her and to settle down and to had so many children. So, yes, I'm going to say diplomatically.
I think that's absolutely the right answer. So another question is just, again, a little more, if you can explore this, about why the Pilgrims might have named their first colony Plymouth. You know, was it named, you know, I know there's been speculation about the town in England, but any other possibilities?
So I've read around this, and I'm not an expert on the original voyage as such, but there is a lot of conflicting information out there. It is definitely true that there was already this site called Plymouth that John Smith had named in 1616 when he mapped New England. Obviously more famous for his role in the Virginia colony, but he named all these places in New England. Most of those names obviously don't survive, but he did mention when he created this map what a great harbour that Plymouth was and how it was such an ideal settling point. So there is some speculation that the map that the Pilgrims used when they were travelling to New England, they were aware that Plymouth was this good site and that possibly this was where they would settle. So, there's conflicting information. Of course, they were meant to be settling in Virginia. They weren't meant to be settling that far north. But there is suggestion that they, saw what John Smith had said about Plymouth and realised that would be a good place to settle. Whether they had any sort of sense of, sentimentality about the port that they'd left, it's hard to say, because the documents that are created by the Pilgrims are not emotive in that sense. They're emotive when they're trying to sell the benefits of the new colony to people back in England, but they're not really expressing themselves as being, lovesick Englishmen that have had to leave behind the Plymouth of Devon. So maybe there was some sentimentality there, but I don't think there is any firm evidence one way or the other. But it's a very, very commonly cited thing that, they named it Plymouth in memory of the port they'd left. But I'm happy to be corrected on that if anyone does have any better information.
Do you have, besides, I know there's a big Pilgrim monument in Southampton. Are there any other memorials or statues or recognition of them in that port city?
Yeah, so there are little things. There are lots of little plaques that are put into various parts of Southampton that have a relationship to the story. So the old city walls in Southampton, which predate the Pilgrims leaving, there is a plaque that says this is probably where the Pilgrims walked on their way to the Mayflower. And there are more modern ones as well. There is a housing estate which was built after the Second World War, public housing, that has a mural, a sort of mosaic mural of the Mayflower as well. So there are little bits dotted around, and a lot of the places and businesses in Southampton take the name of Mayflower. So there's the Mayflower Theatre, for example. And I think it was named the Mayflower Theatre in the 80s or the 90s, so quite recent. And there are lots of Mayflower roundabouts and that sort of thing, Mayflower gyms and so on. So, it is still a part of the landscape in Southampton today, I think. And that memorial still stands there, as does a lot of these other little memories as well.
So we do have a question from Viola, And actually, this is back to the name of Plymouth. Could Plymouth, USA, have been named for Sir Fred Georges, the founder of the state of Maine and a leading principal in Plymouth, UK?
Sounds like a great theory.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any knowledge of that, whether it's possible, but you know, I do wonder if there's a kind of Occam's razor answer to this, which is that the simple answer is probably the most obvious and the most correct, and which is that it was already called Plymouth. You know, that there was a place called Plymouth there, and they just kept the name. But you know, theories are good, speculative theories are good as well, and you know, maybe one day we will discover the reason. We always find new documents. It does happen every now and then, and it'll be an exciting thing if that does happen.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the your project, this Voyaging Through History, the Mayflower and Britain, 1620 to 2020?
Well, it developed really out of my interest in this pageant. So I used to work at King's College London on a project all about historical pageants from 1905 to 2016. And I came across this pageant and I thought, well, this is fascinating. Why would people, you know, reenact the First World War so soon after the end of that conflict? And why would they use the Mayflower as a way to understand that conflict? And it grew from there, really. And I began to trace the different ways that the Mayflower had occurred in British culture. And, you know, everyone knows about how important the Mayflower is in the USA and how it's been a sort of foundation or narrative for the origins of that country. You know, the Mayflower Compact being a forerunner of the Constitution and that sort of thing. So I was sort of intrigued by the fact that it had also been important in England, because it was a negative story for England, really. You know, these people left because it was such an intolerant place for them to live. So we started to explore that, and the project just grew and grew. You know, we started looking at stained glass windows, we started looking at poetry and novels, we started looking at monuments, and then pageants as well. And that was really how it carried on snowballing, and we kind of remain interested in every single aspect of how the voyage has been told in Britain, all the way up to the present, and how it's being told today with the 400th anniversary as well.
Yes, I do want, for those of you who are listening today, who didn't attend Tom's first talk, there is a recording of it that's posted on the Alden website, Pilgrim Memory, and it's really absolutely fascinating and a lot of fun to see some of these amazing sites, especially since you're not able to visit them all at the moment. So another question is a copy of the script. Where could people find that?
So it isn't digitized, but there is a copy in the British Library, and there is also a copy in the Southampton archives. And I think they do occasionally come up on eBay. So if you give yourself a sort of notification on eBay for any mention of John Aldens' choice, you might be able to get a copy of it. I do have a copy that I took by using my camera in the archives. So that's how I kind of can draw on all the information from the script. But unfortunately, I mean, it would be lovely to republish it. I think if there was any interest in republishing the script, which is obviously out of copyright now because it's over 100 years old, and that's how copyright works in Britain, you know, it might be a lovely little thing to redo. It's not hugely long, it's about 30 or 40 pages. And if anyone is listening and does want to do that, I'd be happy to write an introduction for the republication of it as well.
Tom, I'm going to get back to this one more time on the Plymouth thing, because Lee Filson, who's the executive director of See Plymouth and involved with the Mayflower Society and the Meeting House Project, weighed in on this in the chat and said the town was already called Plymouth and was on the map, just like you know, you had said that when they came over. So I think that's probably, yeah.
Well, I'm glad to have it confirmed by an expert.
Yeah. So we had a question actually from the last time, and that is, are you going to be publishing a book?
Yes, we are going to be publishing a book. So we're working on the book proposal at the moment, and that book will cover every sort of way that the story of the Mayflower has twisted and turned from 1620 to the present in Britain. And I hope that it will have a lot of interest for you know, Mayflower descendants, because so many of the sites and the memorials that we talk about in Britain relates to those descendants. You know, that is one way that the story has been told. So it won't be coming anytime soon, hopefully in the next 2 or 3 years. But I will certainly keep you updated on that, and hopefully it will be something that is of interest to people in the States as well as in Britain.
Oh, absolutely. We will hope by then we're visiting those sites as well, as I'm sure we will be. But again, I really want to thank you. We're coming up on our time now. Thank you for both of these fascinating presentations. This one, as well as, again, the one about Pilgrim memory in Britain. Both of them will be posted on the Alden website. And we just thank Tom again for his efforts on our behalf and for sharing this story, and really this delightful, absolutely delightful story of this pageant. You can just imagine it. And I think our mission today for all of us involved in researching this history is to go find a copy of that film, see if it's in that truck somewhere, and get it out. So Tom, thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you to all of us for joining us today. For information about Alden, the Alden House, and the Alden Kindred of America, please visit our website at alden.org, and we look forward to having you join us again. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Desiree.